Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the 18th through the 27th verse of Luke's 9th chapter. And a similar sequence of events, well, three main things happen in this. He receives a correct confession of his identity from Peter, the disciple. Then he gives an explicit prediction of his suffering and death. And then he explains the demands of discipleship. And they are very lofty and exalted. And the question is, why would he ask so much? And the answer is because he only wants the best for us, but the best for us has to come with a price, and that is the price of discipleship. We'll touch on it more, and you can also read similar accounts of the sequence of events in Matthew 16 and Mark 8, but we're going to stick with Luke. Now, beginning in the 9th chapter, he commissions his disciples for the evangelism and tells them much the same things that we read of in Matthew's 10th chapter, although it's a briefer version. And then in the 7th verse, we read that, "And Herod, the district ruler, heard of all that was done by him, and was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead." John had earlier been beheaded at the behest of Herod's wife, he spoke against their adultery, but Herod struggled. He knew that there was truth and strength and power behind this man's message, so he was reluctant to do this. And then Herodias, his wife, sends her daughter Salome, I think it was, to seduce him, and he is so seduced that he offers her any wish, even up until the half of the kingdom, and she, at her mother's behest, requests the head of this man, who was the one who identified and pointed to the Savior to come. He was his predecessor. And so Herod knows that he kills him, but he's reporting the rumors that some said he has been raised from the dead and is alive, and that is the man through whom all these miracles are working, because eventually the word and spread of their effectiveness of their evangelical activity does not escape his notice, because he is the district ruler. And by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the old prophets had risen up. Now John the Baptist was one who came in the power and might of Elijah, we read of in Luke 1:17, and a lot of similarities and parallels exist between them. For example, they wore hairy clothes, and they wore this garment. They were desert-dwelling prophets who spoke messages against society from the distance, and they ate locust and honey and all that stuff. And others say other prophets, and I think Jeremiah is one of the ones who is listed in other accounts, but that's going to come in play. What we read here of Herod is going to come in play in our early dialogue we'll be discussing. "And Herod said, John I have beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such? And he was seeking to see him." So he wanted to know precisely who this man was, and there was a lot of mystery surrounding his identity. Even the disciples perhaps did not fully know, not all of them, but they had walked with him sufficiently enough at this stage for Peter to come to the full awareness and correct confession that he was the Son of the living Elohim. And spoiler alert, not long after correctly confessing his divinity, the one whose identity he had correctly confessed calls him Satan for offering the wrong counsel of advice. And then in between, there's a mass feeding, 4,000 by some accounts. There's no indication here, but they had retreated to a city called Bethsaida, and the crowds followed them, and they healed those, and he spoke and preached the kingdom to come that was already here in their midst, in his presence. And but they don't have food to feed them, so he gathers what things they have and multiplies them sufficiently enough to feed them. And after the range we're going to be covering, we read a few exciting things, namely the transfiguration. We also read of the healing of a lame person, and also an excursion into the Samaritan village, where, we won't dwell on that, and then another prediction of his inevitable suffering. But we're going to focus on the range, verses 18 through 27, the first of which reads, "And it came to be, as he was alone praying, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, saying, Who do the crowds say that I am? So there's two type of followers. There's the crowds and the disciples. The disciples who are the ones who left everything. They had dropped their fishnets. They had dropped their coin collector chains, their tax collector. They had dropped their professions and came and embraced the calling to follow him, go wherever he wants him to go, observe him at all times, live with him, learn from him. And then there were the crowds who were less intimately invested with him. So we find him praying all alone. That's what he does when he gets away. Whenever we have a moment of solitude, we too should be similarly inclined to prayer. But then the disciples were with him interrupts his solace, and he asks them a question: who do the crowds say that I am? And so this is important for us, because before we can bring every question in prayer to Yahweh, but we have to, the prayer precedes the question. We have to begin the formula through which correct praise begins with his prayer, begins with his interest, his name, his kingdom, as we read in the Lord, the disciples' prayer, as I like to call it. You can type in Corey Johnston, John 17 for reasons why, but that's commonly referred to as the Lord's Prayer. And they answering said, John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and others say that one of the old prophets has risen up. So they're reflecting much of what we heard in Herod's reports, when he's reflecting the rumors he had solicited and the rumors that had reached his ear, that this was John the Baptist. He would have been more famous and prominent to the Savior prior at this point, but he's eclipsed him by now in activity. And Elijah was, the book of Malachi, the final book of the Old Testament, closes with the promise of the coming of Elijah, which was fulfilled by John the Baptist himself, or one of the old prophets. So they thought it was, they clearly knew there was something special and distinct about this man. There was something extraordinary about him, but they were wrong to depict him in purely human terms. He was a prophet, but he was greater than a prophet. And he said to them, And you, who do you say I am? And Peter answering, saying, The Messiah of Yahweh. And so Peter is the spokesperson of the disciples. He is the most intimate and loyal lieutenant and trusted companion, and he has an impulsiveness about him. But here he occasionally says things, he very often says things he shouldn't say, but here he says something correct. Messiah of Yahweh, and in Matthew's version we read a more elaborate acceptance of the answer. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. In other words, he did not come to this conclusion and this confession through diligent research or inquiry or independent inquiry. It was revealed to him on high who the man he was walking with him, but he implicitly endorses the answer, as we read in the next verse. And strictly warning them, he commanded them to say this to no one. So there were reasons why he didn't want his identity disclosed prematurely. The Messiah, in contemporary interpretations, carried distinct political and revolutionary tones. He was thought to be the one who would rise, crush all Israel's enemies, and just liberate them from the Gentile powers. So they were at the mercy of, it happened to be the Romans at this moment. And so he wanted to keep this secret, keep it in between them. Just, it was enough that they knew who he was, but don't tell anyone, because there's often a wise and prudent restriction, wiseness and prudence behind his restrictions. And here is where he explicitly tells them that he must suffer and die. Now, prior to this point, there had been several allusions, such as when John the Baptist introduced him as the Lamb of Elohim, that implicitly indicates a sacrificial slaughtering. And also he referred to the destruction of his body. He will raise it up in 3 days, But John makes note in the second chapter that with the gift of hindsight, this meaning catches on to the disciples. They remembered that he said this then, and they didn't know quite what it meant. And also the Moses, the snake, he would be lifted up as the snake in the Exodus generation, the wooden snake, which would heal all infirmities of the snake bitten, who would just look at this snake and be healed, he had to be raised up on the cross again. So this is very vague language. And after this point, he does refer to the sign of Jonah, which is as Jonah spent 3 days in the stomach of the fish, so too would he spend 3 days in the buried in the ground and then rise on the third, as Jonah would be spit out. It comes after this in Luke's account, but it comes before Matthew's version. So we read of Luke's version in the 11th chapter and Matthew's version in the 12th chapter, and the scene we're transcribing or commenting on today, remember, represents the 16th chapter in Matthew's. So there's no, there are, scholars have outlined credible chronological distances, but that's, we recommend that you do the research yourself as to precisely when. But here he says, saying, the Son of Man has to suffer much, and to be rejected by the elders, and the chief priest, and scribes, and to be killed, and to be raised the third day. So the word suffering and kills really stands out to them, and they seemingly, or at least Peter, the impulsive one, well, actually, it doesn't, he doesn't even reject it here, but so I actually, I mistook this for the other synoptic accounts. So there's no resistance in this one, but, the elders would have been the lay people on the Sanhedrin. That was the authorized council of Jewish authorities headed by the chief priest and the scribes, and these three collectively comprised the Sanhedrin, who would judge him, condemn him illegally in the night. And but then he has their assurance that he will be raised on the third day. And he said to them all, if anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. So the word daily really makes the difference, I feel, in making Luke's the passage on this, the demands for the discipleship, just the top notch, because we are in a daily, the Christian life is a 365 a day year gig. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and it's really a daily endeavor, not only daily but 24/7. So every hour of every day we are committed to our calling, and if we are not taking our cross and denying ourselves and not serving a purpose or cause greater than our own immediate self-interest, then we are laxing. And Proverbs 18:9 says, he who is idle is a companion or brother to a great destroyer. So when we get inactive, that's when we invite destructive influences into our lives, which slowly, surely, and imperceptibly, but thoroughly nonetheless destroy us. So there's three elements in discipleship. Self-denial, that means sacrificing one's self-interest, even your own life. He exalted in the next verse, to his cause. Take up the cross daily. We've already elaborated on the daily aspect, and follow me. So after you take up your cross, if there was a cross in his life, the disciples, who by the very definition mimic the master, that describes the disciple-master relationship, have no right or reason or reasonable expectation not to expect a cross in their life. And the cross would have been taken very literally by first century Roman subject citizens, because that was their means of publicly shaming those who were enemies of the Roman state. Roman citizens could not be subjected to it. That's why Paul was not, but Peter was the one who had, I earlier misspoke saying that he called him Satan in the preamble, but that's neither here nor there. Verse 24, for whoever wants to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall save it. So if we value and treasure our own life on earth as the preeminent priority and chief concern, we will forfeit what we value most on this earth in eternity. So the path to eternal life is a surrender and submission of your life to the source, the one who gave you the life. And you have to, this doesn't, this isn't a universal prescription for martyrdom, but the martyr's crown is a legitimate crown. Crown is attached to something of salvific significance. It's a New Testament terminology, which is just as I described it. But if you lose your life for his sake, so that doesn't mean you die of natural death, natural causes, or because you offended some other sinner whose vengeance you provoked and he killed you. It means for his sake. And if it's for his sake, the one who loses his life, literally, in a literal sense, will save it eternally. So they forfeit their life on earth and gain one in heaven. So there's really no adequate balance or of comparison or anything like that. For what is a man profited if he gains all the world and is himself destroyed or lost? So the treasures of the earth come with a price, and one cannot attain it or conquer it or establish oneself in it without the price of being lost or destroyed en route. Because if we're gaining all the world, that means we're self-centered, self-oriented creatures, and this is the opposite of what disciples are geared to. The world is our enemy, one of the three main ones in our spiritual warfare: the world, the flesh, and the devil. So we covet not the things of the world. We do not strive after the acclamations and adulations of the people in the world. And we value as precious our souls and our eternal spirits, and we don't want those to be destroyed or lost. So it is possible to be found or it is possible to be lost once having been found. This concept is enforced by passages such as Hebrews 10:26, 27, and 2 Peter 2:20, 21. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man shall be ashamed when he comes in his esteem, and in his Father's, and of the sacred angels. So the Son of Man is the messianic allusion found 81 times throughout the Gospels. And for example, we read the Messiah sparingly because calling himself the Son of Man was less controversial, and that's how he identifies himself. Here he is the Son, capital, that indicates divinity, and of man. So he is man, but he is more than a man. He is the reconciliation, the bridge between lost and fallen humanity and their divine creator, who longs to bring us home and sent his Son expressly for that purpose. But to the broader scope of the passage, if you are ashamed, this is the opposite. We are to say, I am not ashamed of the good news, as Paul did in Romans 1:16. But it is possible to be ashamed, to suppress it, because you don't want anyone to know that you're taking a stand for your faith, because you covet the esteem of the world, or you succumb to peer pressure, or for anything. But there are consequences for being ashamed to proclaim the name, and that is that you will be rejected, and you will be reduced to shame yourself. You will be ashamed that you were ashamed in this life, in the afterlife, because it's not going to end well for you. You're going to be condemned by the Father and his sacred angels. But truly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death at all till they see the kingdom of heaven. Now, this is one of the things that the scriptural critics and naysayers and atheists and agnostics love to use as certifiable proof that the scriptures are completely fallacious and inaccurate and untruthful. But what he's referring to as the kingdom of heaven is not its final and full arrival, but perhaps in the transfiguration, which occurs next. This takes place 8 days later after this word, in the presence of Peter, John, and Jacob. These are the three most intimate companions, and they are visited and accompanied by the Moses and the Elijah, the representative of the law, and the prophets respectively, who surround the Messiah revealed in his full esteem and splendor. But that's a different story for a different day. That's all the time we have for right now. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.